All right, welcome everyone to one of the more important topics that we'll discuss, and that's the role of glycemic index and load, as well as fiber and fat loss. So, as a review, basically glycemic index is the area under the curve of blood glucose levels in response to a glucose load. Okay? So if you look a high glycemic index, you're going to have a very robust, rapid increase in blood glucose and then a drop. Whereas low glycemic index will be slower and sustained blood glucose response. Glycemic load doesn't just look at the index, it looks at the amount of carbs in a common serving in addition to its glycemic index. So, for example, both carrots as well as pasta have around the same glycemic index. However, there's 5 grams of carbs per serving of carrots, and there's 40 grams of carbs per serving in pasta. So you multiply the glycemic index times the serving size, and we can see that the glycemic load is 2.4 in carrots and 19.2 in pasta. So the glycemic load is much greater. So what's glycemic index effects on fat loss? Well, roughly half of the studies show an effect of glycemic index on satiety and fat loss, and half don't. So a lot of people will go, oh, well, it's a wash then. And those people will be wrong, because you never look at studies by how many have shown positives and negatives, and one needs to outweigh the other. You try and understand why some studies show positive and why some studies show nothing. So one thing we always like to start with is an animal model, because animal models, you have the greatest control. So this study did 18 weeks of high versus low glycemic. 70% of the diet was carbs, 20% was protein, 10% was fat. The food intake was around the same for the low and high glycemic index. Okay, but the body weight was also the same over 18 weeks. However, body composition was different. If you look at body fat percentage, it was higher in the high glycemic group than the low glycemic group. So low glycemic drove body fat downward. And if you look at lean body mass was higher in the low glycemic index than the high glycemic group. So it seems to cause a nutrient sort of a repartitioning effect, okay, or a body composition, a body recomposition effect. But again, and if we look here at blood glucose levels, the low glycemic index has lower resting blood glucose levels and lower insulin levels. So you see that here. Plasma glucose levels by week 5 is lower in the low glycemic than high. We see that insulin levels are lower in the low glycemic than high. Same thing with blood glucose. We also see lower respiratory quotient, which is similar to respiratory exchange ratio. The lower this is, the better. The SAC is basically the low carbohydrate. The low glycemic index. And you see the RQ is lower, indicating higher fat metabolism. And we look again that percent body fat is lower in the low glycemic than high glycemic. And this is a similar rat study, not the same. Again, you see body fat percentage is lower. But remember, these studies gave very high amounts of carbs. 60 to 70% of the diet was carbs. So a more recent study basically took low and high glycemic index in obese individuals under 2 conditions. So at a high carbohydrate, like 55% carbohydrate group, low protein, 15% protein, then a moderate carbohydrate group, which is 45% carbs, and a high protein, 25% protein. So this is looking at overall fat loss. When you had the low glycemic index, high carbohydrate, low protein group, lost as much fat as the high glycemic index, moderate carb, moderate protein group. However, the least amount of fat was lost in the high glycemic, high carbohydrate, low protein group. And then finally, the low glycemic index, moderate carb, moderate protein group. So basically what this is saying is this. If carbohydrates are very high, glycemic index is important. However, if carbohydrates are low and protein's higher, glycemic index is not as important for fat metabolism. So again, this is suggesting that the glycemic load interacts with the glycemic index. High glycemic load, you need to have lower glycemic index foods, or you're going to not lose as much fat, or you might gain fat. If you have low carbs, probably doesn't matter as much. Where it would matter is that you might feel more satiated with higher fiber foods. And again here, this is showing that the low glycemic index, high carb group was similar to the high glycemic index, moderate carbohydrate group. One thing to understand, though, is that glycemic index is not by itself. What you're looking at here is a glycemic index of pasta, or when you add cheese to the pasta, or tuna, which is a protein source to the pasta, it lowers the glycemic index. So just remember that if you have higher protein diets, it's going to lower the glycemic index of the food. As far as glycemic load, this is looking at the ratio of fat loss, where one group, which is the bottom group, is the ratio of fat loss and muscle loss. The bottom group, which is a carb group, had 3.5 grams of carbs per 1 gram of protein. And the upper group that lost more body fat had 1.5 grams of carbs for every 1 gram of protein. And it made them lose a lot more body fat. So it shows that the glycemic load is important. And one thing I want to point out is that glycemic index will make a difference, in particular when you are insulin resistant. So here we have a study. We're looking at essentially the effects of high versus low glycemic index on fat loss in insulin resistant and insulin sensitive people with a 30% calorie restriction. So the black is the high glycemic and the white is the low glycemic. To the left, we have insulin-sensitive people. To the right, we have insulin-resistant people. Notice that the percent weight change is around the same for the high and low glycemic index group and the insulin-sensitive. However, in the insulin-resistant, there's more body fat loss with the low glycemic than high. So it says if you're insulin-resistant, or likely if you have like an endomorphic sort of genotype / phenotype, which is characterized by more of a round face, you store fat easily, particularly in the midsection, that means that you're insulin resistant and glycemic index will matter more in that case. If you're super lean, it's not going to matter as much. And then one thing to point out here is a study where they gave high versus low glycemic index carbs before a run. The high glycemic is the black, and the open circle is the low glycemic. And this fat oxidation. Notice when you had the low glycemic carbs, fat oxidation was greater during exercise than the high glycemic. So probably before exercise, for fat metabolism's sake, you should have lower glycemic index carbs. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is sort of fiber. And we know more fibrous foods are bulkier. You can also use things like air like when you make a shake, it makes a shake airy. They're looking at here is food intake and grams and energy intake. So they have a high energy dense food, a medium energy dense condition, and a low energy dense condition. They essentially have the people eat ad libitum as much as they want of each of these foods. Notice that the food intake was the same between the high, medium, and low energy density foods. However, energy intake was different, with the most energy intake being the high energy dense foods, second amount being the medium energy dense foods, and lowest amount being the low energy dense foods. So this seems to suggest that we have a gram counter for how much food we spontaneously consume in a meal, along with a calorie counter. So this suggests that you might want to select that for weight loss more lower calorie density foods like vegetables, like popcorn, anything that adds air to a food, like blending a shake or adding water. So again, what you're seeing here is that energy intake and portion sizes play have an impact, essentially. So if you look over to the left of this graph, we have a 500 gram, 700 gram, and 900 gram portion size. So it's the open bar, the gray bar, and the black bar. And what you have is a lower energy dense foods, 1.25 kilocalories per gram. And on the right, we have higher energy dense foods, 1.75 kilocalories per gram. What you notice is that the portion size, along with the energy density, will impact how much energy you consume. So in summary, the major determinant of losing fat is likely glycemic load. Individuals will likely lower their carbohydrates to moderate amounts at minimum while increasing protein intake. They should. If an athlete is trying to train more frequently or can handle higher CHO loads, then glycemic index becomes critical as well. Thank you. I'll see you next time. Actually, really quick, if consuming a lower carbohydrate amount of carbohydrate, then glycemic index may not be as important, particularly if fats and proteins are elevated. However, the night before, prior to training for fat loss, or the day of, consuming low glycemic index is the way to go for optimal fat metabolism. Finally, glycemic index matters most for insulin insensitive/resistant individuals.